I was 11 years old the day my mother packed her suitcase and told me she'd be gone, just a month. She said Canada like it was a magic word, like it explained everything. I stood in the doorway of our small apartment watching her check her phone, barely looking at me, her voice rushed and distracted. She pressed 3 crumpled $1 bills into my palm and said I'd be fine, that the neighbors would check in, that I was a smart kid anyway. I didn't understand then how heavy $3 could feel, or how light a promise can be when it's made by someone already halfway gone. The door closed behind her with a sound I would remember for years. It wasn't loud. It wasn't dramatic. It was final. I stood there until the lock clicked, staring at the chipped paint on the door, waiting for her footsteps to come back. They didn't. That first night, I ate dry cereal with water because the milk was spoiled. I counted the dollars over and over, like maybe they would multiply if I believed hard enough. I slept in my clothes because the apartment felt colder without her, even though the heat was on. The next day, I learned what hunger really was. Not the kind where you skip lunch at school, but the kind that makes your stomach twist and your head ache and your thoughts slow down. I walked to the corner store and bought the cheapest loaf of bread I could find. No butter, no jam, just bread. I rationed it slice by slice, telling myself it was temporary, that she'd be back soon. Every day, I crossed another X off the calendar. Every day, the phone stayed silent. School became something I survived rather than attended. I wore the same clothes again and again, washed them in the sink at night and hung them to dry over the shower rod. I lied when teachers asked why I looked tired. I lied when kids asked where my mom was. I learned quickly that honesty made people uncomfortable. Hunger made me quiet, and being quiet made me invisible. Invisible was safer. By the second week, the bread was gone. I started drinking water to trick my stomach. Sometimes I'd fall asleep in the afternoon just so I wouldn't have to feel it. I learned which classrooms had leftover snacks after club meetings and how to walk past without looking suspicious. I learned how to move through the world without asking for anything, because asking meant admitting how alone I was. At night, fear crept in. Every sound from the hallway made my heart race. I slept with a chair wedged under the doorknob. I practiced what I would say if someone knocked and asked where my parents were. I practiced being older than I was. 11 felt like a lifetime ago by then. A month passed. Then another. The calendar ran out of X's. I stopped counting. I stopped hoping. Something inside me hardened, quietly, like wet cement finally setting. I wasn't waiting anymore. I was surviving. One afternoon, I fainted in gym class. When I woke up, a nurse was asking questions I didn't know how to answer. I said my mom was traveling. I said everything was fine. They gave me juice and crackers and sent me back to class. I drank the juice slowly, savoring it like it might disappear if I rushed. At home that night, I sat on the floor and cried without sound, because I didn't want the neighbors to hear. I wasn't crying because I was hungry anymore. I was crying because I understood, finally, that she might not come back. That realization didn't break me. It reshaped me. I promised myself something then, sitting in that empty apartment with my back against the wall. I promised that if I survived this, I would never let anyone abandon me again. And if she ever came back and acted like nothing happened, I wouldn't forget. I wouldn't forgive easily. I would remember every night, every empty cupboard, every lie I told. To protect her absence, I started doing odd jobs around the building. Carrying groceries, taking out trash, cleaning hallways. Most people didn't ask why a kid my age was working. They just liked that I was cheap and quiet. I saved every coin in a jar under my bed. It wasn't much, but it was mine. Control, even a little, felt powerful. Winter came early that year. The heat went out twice. I learned how to wrap myself in blankets and breathe slowly so my teeth wouldn't chatter too loud. I learned how to fix things, how to read manuals, how to solve problems without asking for help. Every skill I picked up felt like armor. When my mother finally came back, it wasn't dramatic either. The door opened one afternoon like it always had. I was doing homework at the table, the jar of coins beside me. I looked up and saw her standing there, suitcase in hand, smiling like she'd just come back from the store. She said my name the way she used to, like nothing had changed. Like I wasn't a different person now. She hugged me, talking fast, apologizing without really apologizing. She said things were complicated. She said Canada had taken longer than expected. She said she did it all for us. I didn't say anything. I didn't tell her about the hunger, or the fainting, or the nights I slept in my clothes with a chair against the door. I nodded. I listened. I learned something important in that moment. People who abandon you don't like to hear about the damage they caused. They prefer a clean reunion. From that day on, I played a role. I was the quiet, grateful kid. I didn't ask questions. I didn't ask for money. I didn't bring up the past. Inside, though, I was counting. Not days anymore, but debts. Emotional ones. Moral ones. I watched her carefully, noticed how easily she forgot what she'd done, how she expected my love to be automatic. I gave it to her on the surface. Underneath, I was building something else entirely. I grew up fast after that. Too fast. By the time I was 15, I was already planning my exit. By 18, I was gone, not in anger, but with precision. I worked, studied, saved, and kept my distance. My mother told people she'd raised a strong, independent child. I let her believe that version of the story. Years later, when they came to me asking for help, for money, for forgiveness, they didn't recognize the person standing in front of them. They saw the child they'd left behind. They had no idea that child had survived on $3 and silence, and had learned exactly how to remember everything. And that was their biggest mistake. I learned early how to disappear in plain sight. After my mother came back from Canada and pretended nothing had happened, I did the same. On the surface, I was obedient, quiet, low maintenance. Inside, I was taking notes. I watched how she spent money on herself while complaining about bills. I watched how she rewrote the story of my childhood when relatives asked questions. In her version, she had been a struggling single mother who sacrificed everything. In mine, I had survived on $3 at 11 years old. Those two truths lived in the same house, never touching. As I grew older, the distance between us wasn't measured in arguments or slammed doors. It was measured in silence. I stopped telling her about school. I stopped asking permission for things I knew she wouldn't care about. I learned to rely on myself in ways that made teachers praise my maturity, and neighbors say I was wise beyond my years. They didn't know that maturity was just another word for abandonment learned too young. By 14, I had a routine. School, work, home. I worked wherever I could. Grocery stores, fast food, cleaning offices late at night. I lied about my age more times than I could count. Every paycheck went into an account she didn't know about. I hid the statements inside old textbooks. Money wasn't about comfort for me. It was about never being trapped again. My mother noticed the changes but interpreted them the way she wanted. She told people I was distant because teenagers are difficult. She told herself I didn't need much because I never asked. When she did try to parent, it was clumsy and performative, like she was following instructions she'd read once and forgotten. I let it slide. Confrontation felt pointless. I wasn't trying to fix our relationship. I was trying to outgrow it. When she remarried, things got worse in quiet ways. Her new husband was polite on the surface but sharp underneath. He had opinions about everything, especially me. About my hours, my attitude, my lack of gratitude. He liked to remind me that I lived under their roof, even though I paid for most of my own expenses by then. I smiled and nodded and kept my head down. I'd learned that arguing with adults who rewrite reality is a waste of breath. College became my obsession, not for passion or dreams, but for escape. I applied to every scholarship I could find. I wrote essays about resilience and hardship, careful to frame them in ways that wouldn't raise too many questions. I didn't want social services involved. I didn't want pity. I wanted leverage. When the acceptance letter came, along with enough aid to leave, I didn't celebrate. I planned. The day I moved out, my mother cried. She told me she'd miss me. She told me she was proud. She told me she wished she'd done things differently. I hugged her, felt nothing, and left. Freedom didn't feel like fireworks. It felt like finally being able to breathe without checking if someone might take the air away. College was hard, but it was honest. If I failed, it was on me. If I succeeded, it was mine. I worked 2 jobs, sometimes 3. I slept 4 hours a night. I graduated early. I kept going. Graduate school, internships, promotions. I built a life brick by brick, quietly, deliberately. I didn't post about it. I didn't announce milestones. I knew better than to invite people back into my life before I understood why they wanted in. My mother called more often once she realized I was doing well. At first, it was small talk. Then questions. Then hints. She complained about money. About health issues. About how unfair life had been to her. She never mentioned Canada. Never mentioned the $3. She talked about the past like it was a foggy inconvenience, not something that had shaped who I was. I listened. I always listened. That was my advantage. People reveal themselves when they think you're still small. The call that changed everything came years later. She was crying, really crying this time. Her husband had lost his job. They were behind on rent. Credit cards were maxed out. She said she didn't know what to do. She said she needed help. She said, "You're my child," like it was a key she could still use. I told her I'd think about it. That night, I didn't feel angry. I felt calm. The kind of calm that comes when a long equation finally balances. I remembered myself at 11, counting slices of bread, drinking water to quiet my stomach. I remembered the calendar with crossed out days that led nowhere. I remembered the promise I'd made on the floor of that apartment, back when survival was my only goal. I didn't want revenge in the way movies show it. I didn't want shouting or public humiliation. I wanted something quieter, something truer. I wanted her to understand, even if she never admitted it out loud, what abandonment costs. I met her a week later at a cafe. She looked older than I remembered. Smaller. She talked fast, nervously, listing problems and excuses. When she finally stopped, she looked at me with expectation. I took a sip of my coffee and told her I couldn't help. Her face collapsed. She asked why. I told her the truth, calmly, without raising my voice. I told her that when I was 11, she left me with $3 and a promise. I told her I learned then that people survive on what they're given. I told her I was giving her exactly what she'd given me. Not money, not rescue, just the lesson. She tried to interrupt. I didn't let her. I wasn't cruel. I wasn't dramatic. I was precise. I told her I'd forgiven her in my own way, but forgiveness didn't mean responsibility. I stood up, paid for my coffee, and left. She called me dozens of times after that. Left messages ranging from apologies to accusations. Family members reached out, confused, judgmental, concerned. I didn't explain myself. I didn't need to. My life was stable, solid, built on choices she'd never been part of. Months later, I heard they'd moved into a smaller place. That she'd taken on extra work. That she was struggling but managing. People said I was heartless. People who hadn't gone hungry at 11 rarely understand restraint. I wasn't punishing her. I was breaking a cycle. One evening, as I sat in my own apartment, warm, full, safe, I realized something that surprised me. I wasn't carrying anger anymore. Not because she'd apologized or made things right, but because I had. I had taken the worst thing that happened to me and used it to build a life where abandonment no longer had power. She went to Canada for a month and left me with $3. When she came back, she expected a child. What she got instead, years later, was an adult who remembered everything and chose herself anyway. And that choice changed everything. Time did what it always does after the noise fades. It settled. The calls stopped. The messages slowed and then ended. My mother learned, finally, that the version of me she could lean on no longer existed. For the first time since Canada, she had to sit with the consequences of her choices without someone else cushioning the fall. I didn't celebrate that realization. I simply lived. I focused on my work, which had grown into something stable and meaningful. I'd built a reputation quietly, the same way I'd built everything else. Reliable, calm, thorough. People trusted me because I didn't oversell myself. I delivered. When promotions came, I accepted them without announcement. When raises followed, I saved them. Security still mattered to me in ways most people never understood. It wasn't greed. It was memory. Sometimes, late at night, the past would surface uninvited. The sound of a door closing. The feel of thin paper bills in my hand. The way hunger sharpens your hearing. But those memories no longer controlled me. They were chapters, not the whole book. I had learned how to place them on a shelf and keep moving. Years passed. I bought my own place. Nothing flashy. Just solid walls, a door that locked, a fridge that stayed full. The first time I stocked it completely, I stood there longer than necessary, staring at shelves of food like they might disappear. They didn't. That quiet permanence felt like victory. My mother reached out again eventually. Not for money this time. For conversation. For closure. She said she'd been thinking a lot about the past. She said she wanted to understand. I considered ignoring the message. Then I considered answering. Not because I owed her, but because I wanted to see who she was now, stripped of urgency and need. We met in a public place. Neutral ground. She looked nervous, older still, but softer somehow. She didn't rush this time. She listened more than she spoke. When she apologized, it wasn't perfect, but it was real. She said she hadn't known how to be a mother. Back then, she said fear had made her selfish. She didn't ask for forgiveness. That mattered. I told her what I'd never said before. Not with accusation, not with heat, but with clarity. I told her what it was like to be 11 and alone. To count coins. To ration bread. To fall asleep afraid. I didn't embellish. I didn't soften it either. I watched her face as the truth landed, watched understanding replace defensiveness. Pain showed up there, and guilt, and something like grief. I let it. When I finished, I told her something else. That I was okay now. That I had built a good life. That her absence had shaped me, but it hadn't destroyed me. That I wasn't saying these things to punish her, but to release both of us from pretending. She cried quietly. I sat with her until the moment passed. When we stood to leave, there was no dramatic reconciliation, no promise of weekly calls. Just an acknowledgement. Just honesty. Sometimes, that's the most complete ending there is. After that, our relationship became something new. Limited. Careful. Real. We spoke occasionally. We didn't rewrite history. We didn't dwell in it either. Boundaries stayed in place, not as walls, but as guardrails. I had learned the difference. The real revenge, I realized, wasn't refusing to help or walking away from a cafe. It was building a life so full and steady that the past no longer dictated my choices. It was becoming someone who could say no without shaking. Someone who could tell the truth without needing it to wound. I went back to that old neighborhood once, years later. The building was still there, paint still chipped, hallway still dim. I stood outside for a moment and looked up at the windows. Somewhere behind one of them, a child might be counting days on a calendar, believing in promises that wouldn't return. I wished I could tell them it wouldn't always be like this. That survival teaches skills no one advertises, and those skills can become power. I left without going in. People often talk about forgiveness like it's a gift you give someone else. I learned it's something you do for yourself, on your own timeline, with your own terms. Mine didn't come with forgetting. It came with understanding and choice. And choice is something no one ever took from me again. My mother went to Canada for a month and left me with $3 at 11. When they returned, they expected a child waiting where they'd left one. What they found, eventually, was an adult who had learned how to stand alone, who remembered every detail, and who chose a future that didn't require permission. That was the part no one expected. And it was enough.